Hello again, this is Kelly from the Minnesota Soil Health Coalition, and I'm joined by Dawn from Prairie Creek Seed.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in to our virtual field day. So we spent some time this morning talking with Jen of the Minnesota Soil Health Coalition and farmer Jamie Labat about soil health. Now we'd like to change gears a little and talk about using cover crops for pasture. We'll hear from Prairie Creek Seed President Karl Dallefeld as well.
Jamie uses rotational grazing to manage his cattle herds, which is a really great way to build that soil health. So I'm excited to hear about this. So let's get back to the field where Karl will talk about cover crop pastures.
Hello everybody, I'm Karl Dallefeld with Prairie Creek Seed, and today we're at Jamie Labat's farm here looking at cover crops. Today we want to go through and look at how to transition from row crop into a long-term pasture, right? Yep. And what we'd like to do is spend a good year, sometimes 2 years ahead of time, helping to restructure and rebuild that soil so that the long-term pasture has a better establishment and we'll be able to get rooted down deeper, quicker for improving pasture. So I'm going to have Jamie tell a little bit of the history and what you've been doing here.
This area we're standing in is a previous row crop situation. Last year it was cash corn. We harvested the crop last fall, took some of the stalks off for bedding, and then this spring I came in with a diverse cover crop mix and seeded it, and I've been rotationally grazing cow calves on it.
So you started this process here last fall already with some late seeded cover crops?
No, I didn't seed anything till this spring, but the intention was to be able to seed it this spring, and I thought it would help a little bit to get some of the bedding off for establishment, and then needed a little bedding anyway. So,
and then we're going to move off and look this direction because this was grazed off a little while ago.
Yeah, where we're standing currently we pulled the cows off about 10 days ago. The field over that he's panned to now was approximately a month and a half ago. I pulled the cows off.
I see. So if we come back this direction again and tell us a little bit about what your next steps are going to be for this pasture, this cover crop.
What I'd like to do with this cover crop is possibly run the cows on more, and then put another warm season cover on to transition into the fall to give them some more feed.
And then, as we were talking earlier, you're going to seed some of this down possibly in mid-August, and then some look at maybe a dormant seeding.
Yes. As we got talking a little bit earlier, kind of came up with a plan to keep it. It's basically split in half here now, and then I rotationally grazing down and back. And so I think if we go and seed it down, some of it this fall or this August, whenever we talked, and then the rest of it a dormant seed, it'll kind of break it up and give us a better chance for establishment, and to break up so we can hopefully graze some of it a little sooner next year. So,
because this is a 10-day recovery period, and this was seeded in April.
April 26th was when this was all seeded.
And this has had one grazing through it.
One grazing through it.
And we're starting to see some recovery coming back this pasture. One thing we got to keep in mind too, this has had zero added
chemical
nitrogen
and zero added commercial fertilizer on it this year. So.
And 0.7 of an inch of rain, I believe.
In the last month and a half, about that, yes.
Because there's a lot of things to look at when we're looking at the cover crops. If we go back to where it's a little bit taller, you sit there and look at it, and we've been here all morning, and the more you start just looking in there, the more species that you see that are in this diverse mix. We have seen buckwheat, the oats, several different types of brassicas, there's the crimson clovers and balansa clovers are in there. There's German millet. There's sorghum sudan.
And there's a few sunflowers.
Sunflowers. There's hairy vetch. I think we even saw a little bit of lentils. And just wanted to give you an overview with all the diversity that is in there. We're going to go now to some slides so we can just show you some up close species that are in this mix. So like I mentioned, you have oats in there. Why don't you go through the list of the diverse?
The original stuff that I see: orange peas, common vetch, persimmon clover, radish, and sunflower. And there are a few other volunteers. The buckwheat and stuff was some volunteer from last year. It's cover crop.
So we do have a lot of diversity in there, and that's one of the things we want to look at when we're trying to convert from either row crop, or we want to actually help our soils get a little more restructured, get the nutrient cycle back into shape a little bit. And we want the grass components, we want the legume components. We also, we want the brassicas, because the brassicas, and we're not just talking a radish, but when you have like T-Raptor and some of these other brassicas, they're going to root down deep and they're going to pull up a lot of nutrients, whereas the legumes are going to be producing some nitrogen for the next crop. And then the grasses, you really want different types because you're going to have different root structures. You're going to have some that are going to dig down deep, help loosen the soil deeper. Some aren't going to look like they have a tremendous root system, but they have a lot of fine hairs.
Yes.
And they're also going to be scavenging nitrogen and getting that back into the nutrient cycle. Next slide.
Okay, that was the one where, yeah, it was drilled the April 26th. I used just a conventional old press drill, and I shot for about 30 pounds per acre on the seeding rate. And it was the biggest thing. It wasn't a really special pick on the mix. It was with some seed I had left from last year. I decided to use that. So,
Well, definitely everything that was in there, we can find it.
yeah, that was nice to see that everything did grow.
Because what you showed on the original slide with what you put in there, the additional stuff out there, like the balance and some of those, it's interesting to see them out there. Next slide.
Oh, okay, we're looking at the rotational grazing now. I've been trying to set it up where I've been trying to move the calves every once a day. Depending on my work schedule, sometimes I'll give them a little more and make them go 2 days, but I've never, this spring now, I'm trying to limit it. I've never had them more than 3 days in one spot, so.
Okay. And even, we talk a lot about perennial pastures and the rest and recovery, and it's going to be somewhat similar with these cover crop annuals. In an ideal world, we would come out here and we would maybe move them once to twice a day. Yeah, but we have lives sometimes too, right?
Yeah, I work a job off the farm, so I try to adapt to the best I can. And I've done a little bit of the research. Some of the covers got taken down a little shorter than probably you would I know you would on a perennial pasture, but with such a young, vibrant, regrowing root, they
rebound quicker.
The plant would come back quicker, and so far it looks like it has. So.
Yeah, and that's, to me, it's important to get a move before it does start to regrow, and then if it's possible, not allow them to back graze onto that. But there are times where we don't have that option, and this is an annual, and we're still getting all the effects of the fruits. So if we're going to be coming in with another set, go ahead and graze it.
Yeah.
Graze it down. Next slide.
Now we're talking about the residue on the as a soil cover, and then also what will be seeded next. I guess the residue, that's, I guess I touched a little bit on that. Trying to leave some as we went farther down, the oats and the other things got a little more mature, so the cows didn't go after it quite as good. So you have a little more residue left down there. And as we talked earlier, the next planned seeding will be a perennial pasture type mix.
Then I wanted to go a little bit. So, you know, looked at those slides, and I wanted to point out a couple other things that I've noticed. This had no commercial fertilizer nitrogen. When you have a cover crop and you had a previous crop, it's probably hard to see it, but there's still some corn stalk residue in here. And as that breaks down, that's going to be tying up some nitrogen. So if you're looking at, I want to maximize the forage yield, it wouldn't have hurt to put a little bit of like ammonium sulfate or something like that out here to increase the growth. And kind of a evidence of that a little bit, I don't know if we can pan down there. There's a manure and urine spot, and you can see where that little extra nitrogen has increased that recovery and that growth. But the cover crop is really what is your intention. And these cover crops are pulling out nutrients and getting them back into that. As these corn stalks break down, they're going to obviously become fertility, organic matter. So as they break down, your cycle's going to continue to get stronger and stronger to where you'll see less differences between where we have the urine spot and where we don't. So the goal, like you said, is to bring this into a perennial pasture. And one of the things that I notice is over the years is when people take a cornfield or even a bean field, work field, and put it right into pasture, there seems to be a time period there, I call it the years of depression, where we don't get the growth and we don't get the rooting down. And a lot of that is that nutrient cycle, cleaning up the soil, getting it good and healthy, so those perennial grasses, which their roots are going to be pretty fine, is to get back, develop quicker and deeper. And that gives you more drought tolerance. And what we'd like to do now is we talked a little bit about the cover crop and the annuals, and talk a little bit about perennial pastures, because you have some perennial pastures.
I do have a
here,
small
Jamie.
amount of perennial pasture here, yes. Can't see it very well. That's worse. I'm not sure.
We're trying to pan through the same picture that you all are watching. And here, rotational grazing for a few years now.
Well, no, this is my biggest year.
This is okay.
I've been rotational grazing cover crops. The perennial pasture was kind of a set stock deal. Oh, there we go. That's much better picture. Thanks, guys. Perennial pasture was more of a set stock because it was a small area, and it just didn't have a big enough, or had a few too many animals for the size. So that's why I changed to the cover crop grazing. I guess was part of it. I don't know.
So currently the different grass species and plants you have in there are white clover, and there's some orchard grass, there's a little bit of bluegrass.
Yeah. And there's a little bit of red clover, some alfalfa there. It's kind of a little bit of a diverse mix from a few years ago. which I've since learned over the few years that I've overgrazed it, and I'm trying to recover from that now. So.
Yeah, and when we were up there earlier looking at it, you were telling me there's spots up there that just absolutely show the evidence of what rest and recovery periods
yes,
can do for
there was a couple spots where I had some old machinery sitting where the cows couldn't get out the last time they were on there, and as we've seen this morning, it was probably 2 or 3 times the forage in them areas as to where they overgrazed it. So it was kind of an eye opener. I mean, it puts it into perspective that way.
And even like with the annual covers on the perennial pasture, it would be great to be able to move them 7-8 times a day, every day, every 3 days. But a lot of times, again, we got to look at how long does that pasture have to recover.
Yep.
And we're going to be looking at recovery periods anywhere between 30 to 45 days, especially when we're in dry weather like we currently have been in. So we just have kind of highlighted this pasture and have kind of touched on it lightly because there's so much. We could go on for hours about how to manage a pasture, and just some key points is don't overgraze if possible.
Yep.
You know, that means 2 or 3 days maybe, but then give it a long enough period to recover. And we're getting into late summer here, and if somebody wants to stockpile for fall or help set up the pastures for next year, after we're off here, we're going to have a short video talking about setting up a pasture for fall. Hey, appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl.
Hello, everybody. This is Karl Dallefeld, and like I mentioned at the field day earlier, I wanted to talk a little bit about fall pasture management, setting up our pastures for the potential of either stockpiling or if we want to do a renovation next spring. Just some tips or thoughts on how to manage at this point. We're already at the end of July or close to it, and how time flies. But now would be the time to be trying to set ourselves up for additional fall grazing or even next year. When we look at what we want to accomplish, not only this fall, but also for next spring, I think we should look at trying to manage for that spring growth and stagger the recovery of the grasses next spring. And some of this also would include the ability to do some fall grazing. When I look at it, on this slide, you can see I have short, medium, and tall. And I'm going to start with short. That would be leaving a stubble height of about 3 to 4 inches. And this is not generally, ideal going into winter, but it would allow us to next spring have the ability to frost seed or interseed into the spring. And when I talk about that short not being the ideal, a lot of times we see pastures that are actually grazed down to 3 or less inches. And that actually could give you the potential to have some winter kill or some winter issues. Grazing it down that short next spring is also going to delay the green up, so to speak. The shorter a grass is going into the winter, the more delayed it's going to be next spring. So I would take individual paddocks that they may be grasses or species in there that you don't like, or maybe they're short on clovers, or maybe there's, you'd like to add more grasses to it. And this would be, in a way, a management tool. Then we look at medium height grazing, stubble height, and that is actually the preferred height. We'd like to see grasses, especially our cool season grasses, introduced species. That height gives you protection against wind desiccation. So if it's an open winter, there's no snow, a lot of times we'll get our winter winds, and that actually can dehydrate or pull moisture out of the root system. This gives you a little bit of protection against that. And it also would would collect some snow if you have the potential for that, which would help insulate that pasture. The next height is tall, and that would be leaving a 6 to 8 inch stubble height. I really don't want grasses going into the winter any taller than that unless we're using it to stockpile for some late fall or early winter grazing. Like I mentioned with the short, stubble height, the 3 to 4 inch stubble height, your taller grasses going into the winter are actually going to start greening up because they've been protected. They may have had some snow, over the top of them, insulating them. And that soil underneath there is going to be a little more biologically active, and it's also going to be a little bit warmer because of the grass's ability to respirate. I like to tell people that grasses don't die over the winter. They're dormant, but they're still breathing. So having that grazing height or the stubble at that 4 to 6 inches also protects a little bit against if we have some ice sheeting to where that grass can be poking up through it and get air to breathe. So that's why it's important looking at what our stubble height is going into the winter. So I just mentioned stockpiling, and that would be accumulating pasture growth in the fall to use as a reserve, something that we can be grazing in possibly October, November, December. You'll hear people say that cattle will dig through the snow to get down to the grasses, and they absolutely will. But to get a pasture to last into January and February, we're going to want additional growth even over what our cool seasons typically will do in the fall. And in order to do that, we're going to have to start reserving paddocks or areas in August and even into late July. If you stop and think about it, how much grass growth do we get in October? We don't get as much as we do in July, August, and even in early September. So in order to get the amount of stockpiling we need to really start in August. I like to look at it from the standpoint, we want to really graze some of these pastures down before heavy snowfall. If you have a stockpiled pasture and we get a lot of snow and it's a heavy snow, it just pushes that grass down. And that can seal out the air and, like I said, create that environment for molds. So if we're going to try to graze into that November into December, we really want to set aside our paddocks now. Fall fertilization is a great time to help build up our grass stands and build up the reserves of those roots going into winter. Through the grazing season, we're constantly, those grasses are having to replenish themselves. And as you go through the summer, the amount of available nutrients literally does go down. So if we do a summer or late summer or a fall fertilization, we can enhance that plant's ability to build up good carbohydrate reserves for the winter. One caution that I'd like to make, a lot of people will use some nitrogen, and you want to do that especially if you're going to be stockpiling forages, because using a little bit of nitrogen can increase the quality and it'll also increase the growth. But we really don't want to do that after mid-September because it'll start accumulating that and it'll be growing longer into the fall. And the fall is the time that plants are starting to go dormant. So we don't want them growing too late into the season. We want them to set themselves up well. For sure, if you're going to be stockpiling, you want to fertilize those paddocks in August. Now, when we look at fertilizer, I've mentioned nitrogen, but a lot of times, especially if you have a soil test, you can look at your phosphorus and potassium. You look at sulfur levels. These are all very important for plant growth and plant energy. So I look at a fall fertilization as you might want some nitrogen in there, but you also want to give it a good balanced fertilizer to go in there. Take a soil test and get an idea where you're at. And I've mentioned before, there's a difference between a soil correction and a fertilization. If you're extremely low in nutrients such as phosphorus or potassium, they can actually reduce the quality of the forages. The forages don't have as much energy. And so it would be good time in the fall to do any of the soil corrections if you need to. If you have pastures that are maybe light in clovers, or maybe you have more clovers than you'd like to have, fall again, and I'm talking mid-August, sometimes up to early September, kind of depending on where you're at, is a good time to interseed or introduce new species into a pasture. Grasses that are out there now more than likely are going to be a little bit earlier in maturity than some of the newer varieties, and they will start going dormant or start slowing down in September, especially getting into October. And if you can interseed at mid-August, you're going to have the existing grasses are going to be slowing down, and then the new grasses are getting established, and they'll grow a little bit longer than the existing grasses because they're trying to develop a plant and a root system. So late summer, midsummer would be a good time to add to it. And one of the ways to do that would be, especially if you're in rolling ground and don't want to do any tillage, would be to graze the pastures that you want to renovate or interseed into. Graze those tight, and then drill in your grasses, and then wait a few weeks. And there's not an exact time or a date, but when the existing grasses are maybe 8 or so inches tall, come in and graze across that again to get sunlight down to the new seedlings. And that will help on their establishment and help them to get set up to make it through the winter. If we wait too late, let's say mid-September, to interseed a pasture, those grasses, especially if we're dry, in a good part of the Midwest, we're dry in September. So if they don't get started in August, they may not germinate and start emerging until October. At that point, they might not get enough size or get enough root reserves to make it through the winter. So timing is important, and also watching to make sure that you have the rainfall or the soil moisture. So what do you interseed? And there's a lot of variables and factors that you would look at to see what you want to interseed. One of the things you want to look at is, what is your harvest method? Is this going to be a pasture that is always going to be grazed? Is it a pasture that you're going to make dry hay off of and then come back in and graze later? Or do you have the option to make baleage? When I look at the difference between baleage and grazing, we can put in a lot of different species and have a lot of diversity. If we're making dry hay, we're going to limit ourselves somewhat, but there are a lot of species that will dry down to make good dry hay. You look at bromes, Paul fescue, orchard grass, timothy, good options that are high quality that will dry down well to make. If you're grazing or you're making baleage, now you can add things like meadow fescue and the ryegrasses. You can add more clover diversity. Realize or recognize what you're wanting to accomplish on your harvesting method. And then one of the other things that I look at is the length of the rest period. When I talk about that, rotational grazing, we're coming in, we're grazing a pasture for a rough or set amount of time. And that's very important that we don't overgraze a pasture. That limits our forage. We all know that. It'll also reduce the diversity of a pasture, because if we're setting a pasture up and we're in there for 2 weeks or a month, they're going to continually graze. They're going to come back and they're going to graze the grasses that are more palatable or younger plants, and then let some of the less desirable grasses be able to seed out or slowly take over a pasture. Typically, as an example, people that are set stocking a pasture or overgrazing tend to have a lot of white clover or Kentucky bluegrass. If you're in an area or your situation is that you need to be back in there roughly every 30 days or 20 days, kind of depends on the time of the year, you're going to limit somewhat your species that you're able to put in. If you can give a longer rest period, you can have a little more diversity and allow all the species to recover. Then we also need to look at our soil types, whether we're on heavy ground or light ground, and then the amount of rainfall and where we're at. Western Minnesota is going to be different than Southeast Minnesota on our rainfall. A lot of you can testify to that. And then also looking at our nutritional goals. Are we cow-calf operation? Are we a stocker operation? Are we a dairy operation? So, what would we interseed into a pasture? If we have a predominant grass stand, we want to get as much diversity as we can. And this would be an example of a blend that we have called Diversifier. But it's more important we're looking at not so much the blend as to what's in it. And in the upper Midwest, red clover, alfalfa, alsike, white clover, the trefoil, and crimson clovers all would bring different things to the pasture, to the nutrition, but also to the soil health part. So we want to get as much diversity as we possibly can. And then you can see at the bottom that the chicory and the plantain, those are Forbs. They're non-legume broadleaves. Chicory and plantain have deeper roots, and they're going to bring up a lot of extra minerals, and they also bring other, benefits to total forage quality. This year, we're seeing a lot of white clover. We've had a great year with the moisture and the temperatures, especially in eastern Minnesota and western Wisconsin. And we don't see quite as much grass in some of those stands. So you might want to be interseeding or adding grasses. And these are some of the pasture blends. And I'm just using these as examples. It goes along with that rest and recovery period. Grazing with a 20 to 30 day, rest period for the grasses. You see Renovator and Maxigraze there. Those have species in them. We still got a fair amount of diversity, but they have species that can tolerate that frequent grazing. Renovator would have tall fescue, meadow fescue, orchard grass, timothy, perennial ryegrass, and then there are also festaloliums. These are all grasses that, by their nature, will recover quicker than some of the other grasses. And then you can see the next line down, we have Diverse Master. This is for those producers that are able to give a longer rest and recovery period. I would say 40 plus days. And you'll notice that I don't give exact days because we know in the spring they're going to recover quicker. In the summer, they're going to take longer with moisture and heat. Diverse Master has 16 different species in it. In addition to what's in Renovator and Maxigraze, it also has the bromes, some of the other grasses that are going to require a longer recovery period. And then you can see Stockman and Range Max. These are blends that have species that can tolerate set stock grazing. When I talk about set stock grazing, that means these are pastures that we have a set amount of acres and we have so many cows, we put them in for the summer, and we're not allowing any rest or recovery period through the course of the summer. We talked earlier about whether you're going to be making baleage or dry hay. Energy Plus is a grazing or a baleage type. This would have those grasses that aren't necessarily going to dry down well compared to what's in Haymaster, which is a orchard grass, tall fescue, timothy mix. Those are all species that dry down well. Energy Plus would have the meadow fescues and the perennial ryegrasses and tall fescues. So when you're looking at what to interseed into a pasture, take into consideration, the soil types and also the harvesting method. I went through that pretty quickly, and we just wanted to kind of get a quick overview of what to do for this fall, setting up for next year, also possibly for stockpiling for this fall. So if you have any other questions, feel free to give us a call, or you can contact us through email at info@prairiecreekseed.com. Thank you very much.